A world-renowned neurosurgeon, Dr. Erica Billiot, stands trembling in the freezing rain of a prestigious cemetery, clutching a folded American flag to her chest. As her mother and brother walk away into the warmth of a waiting limousine, leaving her alone by a mahogany coffin, she dials a number the elite world considers a joke. Ji-Hoon, she whispers, her voice breaking as the first teardrop falls. They took the flag. I'm done being their ghost. Please, come get me. It establishes the justice porn hook by showing a stoic and brilliant woman finally broken by the people who were supposed to protect her. This sets the stage for a massive, satisfying power shift when the ghost finally arrives. In the sterile blue-tinged light of the Seoul Medical Center, Dr. Erica Billiot was a goddess of precision. Her hands, encased in latex, moved with a fluidity that bordered on the supernatural, navigating the microscopic pathways of a human brain with the steady grace of a master weaver. In Korea, she wasn't just Sarah Billiot's daughter or Kevin's overachieving sister. She was the Blade of Mercy, a woman whose name was spoken in hushed tones of reverence by interns and veteran surgeons alike. Yet, when the scrubs came off and the adrenaline of the operating theater faded into the hum of the city, Erica retreated to a life that remained a total enigma to her colleagues. To the world of international medicine, she was a stoic workaholic. To her family back in the States, she was an asset, a brand name they could drop at cocktail parties to bolster the Billiot legacy. None of them knew that every evening, a sleek, unassuming black sedan waited in the hospital's private bay to whisk her away from the world of science and into a world of shadows. The man behind the wheel was always the same, Ji-Hoon Kong. To the few Billiots who had bothered to ask, Erica described him as a quiet businessman, a description she knew they translated as boring and unsuccessful. In their eyes, if a man wasn't a partner at a white shoe law firm or a tech mogul on the cover of Forbes, he was a non-entity. They pictured him in a dusty office, perhaps managing logistics or small-scale imports, a man who lived on the periphery of Erica's greatness. The reality, however, was far more complex. Inside their sprawling villa tucked away in the hills of Songbukdong, Ji-Hoon was not a nobody. He was the anchor that kept Erica from drifting away into the cold, clinical void of her profession. He was the man who had learned her favorite tea, the exact temperature she liked her bath after a 12-hour surgery, and the specific way her eyes clouded over when a letter arrived from her mother. "You're thinking about the funeral," Ji-Hoon said one evening, his voice a low melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. He sat across from her in their private library, the golden light of the fireplace catching the sharp, masculine line of his jaw. He wasn't wearing a suit then, just a simple black sweater that didn't quite hide the coiled power in his shoulders. Erica looked up from her tablet, the glowing screen reflecting the exhaustion in her dark eyes. "My mentor deserves a proper send-off. He was the only person who saw me as a doctor before he saw me as a Billiot." "Then you should go," Ji-Hoon replied, his dark eyes that missed nothing, tracking the way her fingers tightened around the device. "But you know they will be there. Kevin and Sarah. They don't see a funeral, Erica. They see a stage." Erica sighed, a sound of bone-deep weariness. "I can handle them. I've been handling them my whole life. Besides, Kevin is busy with his firm. He won't have time to cause a scene." Ji-Hoon didn't argue. He knew Erica's fatal flaw, her savior complex. She believed she could fix anything. A shattered skull, a broken family, a mother's cold heart, if she just tried hard enough. He stood up, his movement smooth and deliberate, like water flowing over stone. He crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was light, but the protection behind it was absolute. "They think I am a ghost, Erica," he whispered, leaning down so his breath fanned her ear. "A failed man you keep in the background because you are ashamed. Let them keep thinking that. It is safer for them to believe the lie than to face the truth of what I am." Erica leaned back into his warmth, closing her eyes. In that moment she felt invincible. She was the best surgeon in the world, and she was loved by a man who possessed resources her family couldn't even fathom. She thought she was going to the US to bury a mentor and face a few days of socialite snobbery. She didn't realize that Kevin was already sharpening his forgeries, and Sarah was already weaving the cage she intended to put Erica in. She didn't know that the quiet businessman she left behind in Seoul was already preparing his ghost to move. As Erica packed her bags, She kept her secret husband tucked away like a hidden weapon, never imagining that by the time she reached the rain-slicked cemetery in Virginia, he would be the only thing left standing between her and total destruction. She was a surgeon who believed in the power of the blade, but she was about to learn that some wounds required a much more dangerous kind of intervention. The heavy, humid air of Virginia felt like a damp shroud as Dr. Erica Billiot stepped off the private jet. She had traded the neon-soaked vibrancy of Seoul for the muted grays of her hometown, but the transition felt less like a homecoming and more like a descent. In her hand, she clutched a small leather-bound notebook, her mentor's final gift, as if it were a talisman against the impending storm. She was exhausted, the kind of weariness that seeped into the marrow, yet she stood with the rigid, unbreakable posture of a woman who had spent a decade commanding operating rooms. As she moved through the terminal, she felt the familiar, prickling sensation of being watched. It was a feeling she usually associated with the silent, protective presence of Ji-Hoon's men in Korea, but this was different. This was cold. This was predatory. The black town car waiting at the curb was driven by a man she didn't recognize, but the crest on the door told her everything. Her mother had sent a car, not out of love but out of a need for optics. The Billiots did not take taxis. As the vehicle glided toward the historic Billiot estate, Erica watched the familiar landscape blur past. The rolling hills and ancient oaks should have brought comfort, but they only reminded her of the scraps of affection she had spent 28 years trying to turn into a feast. Upon arriving at the house, the atmosphere was already thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. The prodigal daughter had returned, but there was no fatted calf, only a gauntlet of judging eyes. "Erica, you're late," Sarah Billiot remarked without turning from the hallway mirror, her fingers expertly adjusting a strand of pearls. She looked timeless, a socialite whose face was a masterpiece of carefully maintained indifference. "The pre-funeral reception has already begun. People are asking why the world's greatest neurosurgeon couldn't manage a flight schedule." "The flight was on time, Mother," Erica replied, her voice low and even, mirroring the stoic calm she had cultivated in Seoul. "I went to the hospital first to check on the final arrangements for the memorial scholarship." A sharp, mocking laugh echoed from the study door. Kevin Billiot leaned against the frame, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, though it couldn't hide the restless, hungry energy that always radiated from him. He swirled a glass of amber liquid, his eyes tracking Erica with a chilling intensity. "Always the saint, aren't you, Rick?" Kevin said, using the childhood nickname she detested. "Saving lives, saving legacies. It must be exhausting being so perfect." "It's called a career, Kevin," Erica countered, refusing to take the bait. "Something built on skill, not just social standing." Kevin's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Skill is a fragile thing. One slip of the hand, one bad headline, and the goddess falls. You should be careful. The higher you climb, the harder the wind blows." Erica felt a flicker of unease, a shadow of the dangerous intuition she had seen in Bongo back in the bakery, though Kevin's version was twisted and malicious. She didn't notice the way Kevin's thumb hovered over his phone, or the smug look he exchanged with their mother. She was too focused on the grief of losing her mentor to see the trap being laid. The house was filling with the elite of the medical and legal worlds. Erica was passed from hand to hand like a trophy, her accomplishments cited as proof of the Billiot bloodline's superiority. Yet, beneath the praise, there was a strange, hushed frequency to the room. Groups of people would fall silent as she approached, their eyes darting to their phones before looking back at her with a new, unreadable expression. She felt invisible in a room full of people who knew her name, a constant physical reminder that she was only valued for what she could provide to their reputation. She thought of Ji-Hoon, of the way he truly saw her, and she reached for her phone in her pocket. A quick text just to feel grounded. "I'm here. It's exactly as you said." The response was immediate. "I am with you. Do not let them make you small." Refortified, Erica turned back to the crowd, unaware that in the corner of the room, Kevin was handing a flash drive to a prominent medical board member. He was whispering about integrity and unfortunate discoveries, his face a mask of feigned brotherly concern. The funeral service at the Gothic cathedral was set for the following morning, and the biggest moment of tension was already coiling like a spring. Erica believed she was there to honor a great man's life. She didn't realize that by the time the first shovel of dirt hit the coffin, her own life would be the one under the blade. She walked into the heart of her family's territory, a brilliant surgeon who could map every nerve in the human body, but who remained completely blind to the rot within her own home. As the sun set over the Virginia hills, casting long skeletal shadows across the estate, the stage was set. The forgeries were in place, the rumors were spreading like a virus, and the Billiot family was ready to excise their most successful member to save their own pride. Erica went to bed in her childhood room, surrounded by old trophies and anatomy books, not knowing that this would be the last night she would ever be allowed to call herself a Billiot. The morning of the funeral wake, the air in the Billiot ballroom was thick with a calculated, funereal silence. Erica stood near a towering arrangement of white lilies, her spine a rigid line of professional composure. She had spent the morning greeting dignitaries and former colleagues of her mentor, her voice steady and her gaze unwavering. To the outside world, she was the pinnacle of the Billiot legacy, but inside, she felt the familiar, suffocating pressure of her family's expectations. Kevin moved through the room like a shark in a silk suit. He didn't approach Erica directly. Instead, he hovered at the periphery of the most influential circles, his expression a practiced mask of somber concern. In his hand, he carried a leather folio, ostensibly containing the eulogy notes for the afternoon service. He waited until a group of senior medical board members, men who held the power to grant or strip the very licenses Erica lived by, were gathered near the refreshment table, discussing the future of the hospital's neurosurgery department. "It's a tragedy," Kevin murmured, stepping into the conversation with a sigh that sounded like a morning bell. "To lose a pioneer like him, and at a time when the department is already facing such internal turbulence." The board members looked at him, their interest piqued by the subtle drop in his tone. "Turbulence, Kevin? We were under the impression the Billiot name was as stable as ever." Kevin looked down, his fingers clumsily fumbling with the folio. "I shouldn't have said anything. It's a family matter. Or rather, a professional one that the family is trying to manage quietly." As if by accident, the folio slipped from his hand, hitting the edge of the table and spilling several pages of official-looking documents across the mahogany surface. Erica, watching from across the room, saw the movement. She didn't see the content of the papers, but she saw the way the board members froze. They didn't just pick the papers up. They scanned them. Their eyes widened, darting from the text to Erica, then back again. Kevin scrambled to gather the sheets, his face flushed with a feigned, panicked embarrassment. "I am so sorry," Kevin whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "These were meant for our legal team's private review. Please forget you saw that." But it was too late. The forged scalpel had already made its first cut. The documents, expertly crafted to look like an internal investigation from her hospital in Seoul, suggested that Erica had been under a secret probationary period for a series of catastrophic surgical errors. They outlined a narrative of a disgraced surgeon who had fled to Korea to hide a trail of malpractice, only to have it follow her home. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The hushed whispers were no longer about the deceased mentor. They were about the woman standing among the lilies. The warmth left the eyes of her peers, replaced by the cold, analytical distance doctors reserved for a failing patient. Erica felt the shift like a drop in barometric pressure. She saw her mother, Sarah, standing by the window, watching the scene unfold with a terrifying, calm satisfaction. Sarah didn't move to help. She merely adjusted her pearls, her silence a seal of approval on Kevin's betrayal. Erica's phone buzzed in her pocket. A sharp, insistent vibration. It was a notification from a medical news aggregate. The leak was already moving beyond the room. Kevin had not just dropped papers. He had dropped a grenade into her career. He walked past her a moment later, his shoulder brushing hers as he leaned in to whisper, "Careful, Rick. You know how you photograph when you're caught off guard. Try to look innocent for the cameras." He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward the bar, leaving Erica standing in the center of a prestigious room that had suddenly become a courtroom. She looked at her hands, the hands that had saved thousands, the hands that were now being branded as lethal. She thought of the secret husband waiting in the shadows of Seoul, the only person who knew the truth of her skill and the depth of her family's rot. The forged scalpel had drawn blood. But as Erica felt the cold sting of the room's disdain, she realized she was no longer fighting for her career. She was fighting for her life. And for the first time she was done trying to perform a miracle for people who only wanted to see her bleed. Erica sat in the front pew, her hands folded over the leather-bound notebook of her mentor, feeling the cold weight of the cathedral's judgment. The forged scalpel of Kevin's leaked documents had done its work. The whispers behind her were no longer muffled. They were sharp, clinical, and surgical in their precision. She was being dissected in the very house of God by the peers she had once led. "You look like you're waiting for a miracle," Kevin said, sliding into the pew beside her. He didn't look at the altar. He looked at his watch, a gold piece that cost more than some of the medical equipment Erica used to save lives. "But miracles aren't for people like you anymore, Rick. They're for people with clean records." Erica didn't turn her head. "I know it was you, Kevin. I know you forged those signatures." Kevin leaned in, his voice a low, toxic hum. "Does it matter? In 5 minutes, the board will announce your voluntary resignation to the press waiting outside. Mother has the statement ready. You're going back to the family clinic to handle the paperwork, while I take over the Billiot Foundation's legal interests. That's the deal. And if I refuse?" Kevin chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Then you go back to that husband of yours in Seoul. What was his name? Ji-Hoon? The man who couldn't even afford to fly business class to his own wife's mentor's funeral? The man who spends his days consulting, while you do the heavy lifting." He shook his head with mock pity. "He's a failure, Erica. A nobody. If you go back to him, you're choosing a life of scraps. You'll be the disgraced surgeon married to the invisible man. Is that really what you want for your legacy?" Erica felt the bone-deep exhaustion of the past decade rising up to meet her. For years she had let Kevin's insults slide, believing that her silence was a sign of strength. She had let her family treat Ji-Hoon like a shadow because she wanted to protect the peace. But as she looked at Kevin's smug, entitlement-filled face, she realized that her silence hadn't been strength, it had been permission. "You think he's small because he doesn't need to shout to be heard," Erica said, her voice finally losing its tremor. "I think he's small because he is small," Kevin countered, standing up as the organ music began to swell, signaling the start of the processional. "He's a non-entity. A ghost. And ghosts don't win against the Billiot family. Now get ready to walk behind the coffin. Try to look like someone who still has a shred of dignity left." He walked away, confident in his victory, unaware that the ghost he had spent months mocking was currently moving toward the cemetery with the weight of an empire behind him. Erica gripped her mentor's notebook one last time before tucking it away. She wasn't just walking toward a grave. She was walking toward the end of the Billiot era. Kevin thought he had trapped a disgraced doctor, but he was about to find out that he had offended a woman who had the sovereign of the Baek-ho Syndicate on speed dial. The failure was coming, and he wasn't bringing a briefcase. He was bringing the storm. The sanctuary of the cathedral was cold, the air thick with the scent of ancient stone and expensive lilies, but the chill coming from Kevin was far more biting. As the guests began to filter out toward the cemetery for the final interment, Kevin lingered in the pew next to Erica, his presence a suffocating weight. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of a brass memorial plaque, a smug victor's grin playing on his lips. "You look like you're waiting for a miracle, Erica," Kevin said, his voice a low, toxic hum that didn't belong in a house of worship. "But miracles aren't for people like you anymore. They're for people with clean records and useful futures." Erica didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes fixed on the altar, her hands gripping her mentor's leather-bound notebook so hard her knuckles were white. "I know it was you, Kevin. I know you forged those signatures on the malpractice reports." Kevin let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "Does it matter? In an hour, the board will announce your voluntary resignation to the press waiting at the gates. Mother has the statement ready. You're going back to the family clinic to handle the filing and the back office insurance claims, while I take over the Billiot Foundation's legal interests. That's the deal. That's your place. And if I refuse to play along with your lie?" Kevin leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence. "Then you go back to that husband of yours in Seoul. What was his name? Ji-Hoon? The man who couldn't even afford to fly business class to attend a funeral of this caliber? The man who spends his days consulting in back alley offices while you do the heavy lifting. He shook his head with mock pity, a glint of predatory joy in his eyes. He's a failure, Erica. A nobody. A ghost. In our circle, men like that don't even qualify as background noise. If you choose him over us, you're choosing a life of scraps. You'll be the disgraced surgeon married to the invisible man. Is that really the legacy you want? Erica felt the bone-deep exhaustion of the past decade rising up to meet her. For years she had let Kevin's insults slide, believing that her silence was a sign of professional stoicism. She had let her family treat Ji-Hoon like a shadow, a shameful secret she kept tucked away in Korea, because she wanted to protect the fragile piece of the Billiot name. But as she looked at Kevin's face, a face that had never known the weight of a scalpel or the responsibility of a human life, she realized her silence hadn't been strength. It had been permission. You think he's small because he doesn't need to shout to be heard, Erica said, her voice finally losing its tremor and gaining a dangerous clinical edge. I think he's small because he is small, Kevin countered, standing up as the organ music began to swell, a mournful heavy processional. He's a non-entity. He has no firm, no board seats, no reputation. He's a failed businessman who hit the jackpot by marrying a Billiot. And now that the Billiot name is being stripped away from you, he'll have nothing left but his own insignificance. He patted her shoulder, a gesture that felt like a brand. Now get ready to walk behind the coffin. Try to look like someone who still has a shred of dignity left, even if we both know it's just theater. He walked away, his stride confident and rhythmic, moving toward their mother who waited at the heavy oak doors. He was a man who believed the world was governed by titles and tax brackets, entirely unaware that the ghost he had spent months mocking was currently moving toward the cemetery with the silent, terrifying precision of an approaching storm. Erica reached into her pocket and felt the vibration of her phone. A single message glowed on the screen. I am at the gates. She tucked the notebook into her coat, her eyes hardening. Kevin thought he had trapped a disgraced doctor in a cage of her own making. He thought he was about to witness the final burial of Erica's independence. He had no idea that the failure he despised didn't deal in lawsuits or social standing. He dealt in absolute loyalty and devastating consequences. As she followed the funeral procession into the gray afternoon light, Erica wasn't mourning her mentor anymore. She was waiting for the moment the Billiot family realized they hadn't just exiled a daughter, they had invited a sovereign to their door. The sky over the Virginia hillside had turned the color of a fresh bruise, heavy and swollen with the rain that had finally begun to fall. The mourners stood in a semicircle around the open grave, a sea of black umbrellas shielding the elite from the elements. Erica stood at the very edge of the artificial grass, the cold wind whipping her hair against her face. In her arms, she held the triangularly folded American flag, the ceremonial tribute given to her mentor's closest protege. It was heavy, the fabric stiff and smelling of cedar and history. To Erica, it was more than wool and thread. It was the physical proof that she had been seen, valued, and chosen by the man who taught her that a surgeon's greatest tool was her integrity. Sarah Billiot stood directly across from her, looking like a statue of obsidian. She didn't use an umbrella. Kevin held one over her, his eyes darting toward the cemetery gates as if expecting the failed businessman to roll up in a beat-up sedan at any moment. The silence of the graveside was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of rain against silk and the distant caw of a crow. It's a beautiful tribute, Sarah said, her voice carrying through the damp air with chilling clarity. She wasn't looking at the coffin. She was looking at the flag in Erica's arms, a symbol of a legacy that requires a certain purity of character to uphold. Erica tightened her grip on the flag. He left it to me, Mother. He wanted me to have it. He left it to a world-class surgeon, Sarah countered, stepping forward until she was inches away from Erica. The scent of her floral perfume felt like a physical assault in the mud-slicked air. He did not leave it to a woman whose name is currently being dragged through every medical journal in the country. He did not leave it to someone who is one board meeting away from being a pariah. The allegations are false, Erica whispered, her voice straining against the lump in her throat. You know they are. Kevin knows they are. Kevin didn't look away, a faint mocking smirk touching his lips. It doesn't matter what we know, Rick. It matters what the world believes. and the world believes you're a liability. Keeping that flag is an insult to his memory. It belongs with the family, the real Billiot legacy. Sarah reached out, her gloved hands hovering near the edge of the blue field of stars. Give it to me, Erica. Don't make a scene in front of these people. You've already embarrassed us enough today. Let go of the things you no longer have the right to carry. No, Erica said, her voice finally cracking. This is mine. It's the only thing I have left that you didn't give me. The mask of the grieving socialite slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the predatory coldness beneath. With a swift, forceful movement, Sarah reached forward and gripped the edge of the flag. Erica recoiled, but Sarah was relentless. It wasn't just a grab, it was a reclamation. Sarah yanked the heavy fabric toward her chest, the force of it nearly pulling Erica off her feet toward the muddy lip of the grave. You are unworthy of this, Sarah hissed, her eyes locking onto Erica's with a terrifying intensity. You are no longer a Billiot surgeon. You are a disgrace. And until you sign those papers and return to my house, you have nothing. No name, no career, and certainly no legacy. With one final violent tug, Sarah ripped the flag from Erica's arms. The loss was visceral, a constant physical reminder that her family was willing to strip her of her very soul to maintain their control. Erica stood there, her arms suddenly light and empty, her hands trembling in the cold. She looked at her mother, who was now clutching the flag as if it were a trophy of war, and then at Kevin, who looked on with bored satisfaction. Around them, the elite of Virginia watched in hushed, horrified fascination. They saw a mother disciplining a wayward daughter. They saw a fallen star being put in her place. Erica felt the bone-deep exhaustion crystallize into something else, something cold, hard, and final. The rain began to fall harder, soaking through her suit, but she didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt the clarity of a person who had lost everything and realized they were finally dangerously free. You're right, Mother, Erica said, her voice suddenly devoid of emotion, as flat and sharp as a scalpel. I don't have a name anymore. Not yours, anyway. She didn't wait for a response. She turned her back on the grave, on the flag, and on the woman who had spent 30 years trying to break her. She pulled her phone from her pocket and walked toward the cemetery road, her heels sinking into the mud but her head held higher than it had been all day. Behind her, Sarah began to speak to the crowd, her voice regaining its polished, socialite lilt, but Erica wasn't listening. She was looking at the horizon, where the first of 12 black, armored SUVs had just crested the hill, their headlights cutting through the gray rain like the eyes of a predator. The failed businessman had arrived, and he wasn't there to mourn. He was there to collect his queen. The interment was over, but the air remained thick with the suffocating residue of high society performance. One by one, the black umbrellas drifted away like a retreating tide, the mourners offering hushed, performative condolences to Sarah and Kevin. No one looked at Erica. She had been effectively excommunicated in front of the very people who once sought her counsel on life and death surgeries. She stood 10 feet away from the grave, her feet sinking into the churned, red Virginia clay, watching her family lead the exodus. Sarah walked past her first, the stolen ceremonial flag tucked under her arm like a trophy. She didn't offer a glance, her profile as sharp and cold as the headstones surrounding them. Kevin followed close behind, pausing only long enough to offer a crooked, pitying smile. The car for the reception is full, Rick, Kevin said, his voice light, almost cheerful. But I'm sure that husband of yours is around here somewhere in his, whatever it is he drives. Or maybe you can walk. It's only 5 miles. Good for the heart, right? He didn't wait for her to answer. The sound of their footsteps faded, replaced by the heavy thud of luxury car doors closing in the distance and the collective purr of engines as the Billiot convoy departed. Within minutes, the prestigious cemetery was empty. The silence that followed was not the peaceful rest of the departed. It was the grave silence of a woman realizing she had spent 30 years building a temple for gods who never intended to bless her. The rain turned from a drizzle into a steady, punishing downpour. Erica's tailored black suit, once a symbol of her professional stature, was now a heavy, sodden weight clinging to her skin. She looked down at the mahogany coffin, now being lowered by a silent mechanical lift, and realized that her mentor was the last person in this country who had loved her without a ledger in his hand. She thought of the thousands of hours she had sacrificed for the Billiot name. The missed birthdays, the holidays spent in the ore, the way she had shrunk herself to fit into the narrow, prestigious mold her mother had designed. She had believed that if she was brilliant enough, if she was perfect enough, the conditional love would finally become unconditional. But as she stood alone in the mud, she saw the truth with the terrifying clarity of a surgical diagnosis. They didn't just dislike her choices, they actively enjoyed her destruction. Kevin didn't want her success, he wanted her vacancy. Sarah didn't want a daughter. She wanted a prestigious extension of her own ego. They hadn't disowned her because of a scandal, they had created the scandal so they could finally own her. A jagged flash of lightning illuminated the rows of granite crosses, and Erica felt a strange, cold laugh bubble up in her chest. She had spent her life mapping the most complex organ in the human body, yet she had been blind to the rot in her own bloodline. The bone-deep exhaustion she had been carrying for years suddenly snapped, replaced by a crystalline, lethal stillness. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen was wet, the light blurring in the gray afternoon, but the connection was stable. She didn't call her lawyer. She didn't call the medical board. She looked toward the cemetery gates, where the long winding road met the horizon. I was so afraid of losing them, she whispered into the rain, her voice finally steady. I was terrified of being alone. She looked at her hands, the hands that Sarah had tried to chain and Kevin had tried to break. They were steady. In the silence of the grave, Erica realized that she wasn't the one who had lost everything. She was the only thing of value the Billiot family had ever possessed, and she was currently walking out of their lives forever. The distant sound of tires on wet pavement began to grow, not the high-pitched hum of the Billiots' luxury sedans, but a deep rhythmic rumble that shook the very ground she stood on. A line of dark shapes appeared at the gates, cutting through the mist with the predatory grace of a wolf pack. Erica didn't move. She didn't hide. She stood her ground in the mud, watching as the failed businessman's world finally collided with the ruins of her own. She was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a disgraced surgeon. She was a woman waiting for the only person who had ever seen her as a queen. The silence was over. The storm had arrived. In the high-tech sanctuary of his Seoul command center, thousands of miles from the rain-slicked misery of Virginia, Ji-Hoon watched a bank of monitors displaying the global movements of the Baek-ho Syndicate. He was a man of absolute stillness, a predator who moved only when the outcome was already guaranteed. To the Billiot family, he was a ghost, a failed businessman they could mock with impunity. But in this room he was the sovereign, the master of a shadow empire that moved the world's silent capital. The encrypted phone on his desk, a line reserved for only one person, vibrated with a sharp, insistent hum. Ji-Hoon didn't hesitate. He reached out, his hand steady and scarred, and answered before the second ring. Ji-Hoon. Her voice came through thin and fragile, breaking like glass under the weight of 1,000 betrayals. They took the flag. I'm done being their ghost. Please, come get me. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The technicians and security details, men who had seen Ji-Hoon order the dismantling of rival cartels without blinking, felt a sudden visceral shift in the barometric pressure of the room. The quiet husband was gone. In his place stood a man whose eyes had turned into chips of black flint. He didn't ask for details, he didn't need a map. He had known the Billiots would eventually draw blood. He had simply been waiting for Erica to decide she was finished being their victim. I am already in the air, Ji-Hoon said, his voice dropping into a register that was low, lethal, and absolute. Stay exactly where you are. Do not speak to them again. Do not look at them. You are no longer their daughter, Erica. You are mine. He ended the call and looked at his second in command, a man named Min-ho who had been standing at attention since the phone rang. The businessman facade was being stripped away in real time. Ji-Hoon stood up, his tailored sweater replaced by the heavy tactical weight of a sovereign's mantle. The Billiot estate, Ji-Hoon commanded, the Korean syllables sharp and final. Every asset we have on the East Coast. Every SUV, every operative, every digital shadow. I want their accounts frozen by the time I touch down. I want Kevin Billiot's leaks traced back to his personal IP within the hour. And Min-ho. Yes, sovereign. Tell the security detail to prepare for a retrieval. We aren't just bringing home my wife. We are reclaiming a queen. If anyone stands in the way, If a single Billiot so much as breathes in her direction, handle them with the severity they have earned. As Ji-Hoon walked toward the private hangar, the transformation was complete. The failed man the Billiots laughed at was dead. He moved with a terrifying rhythmic precision, his mind already 3 steps ahead of Kevin's petty forgeries and Sarah's socialite manipulations. He knew exactly what they had done. He knew they had tried to shrink Erica until she disappeared, unaware that she was anchored to the most dangerous man in Seoul. The Gulfstream's engines roared to life, a mechanical growl that mirrored the fury burning beneath Ji-Hoon's skin. He looked at the wedding ring on his finger, a simple band that represented the only piece of his soul he had left in the light. Sarah Billiot thought she had won a game of reputation. Kevin thought he had won a game of inheritance. They had no idea that they had just invited a sovereign to their doorstep, and that the ghost they had spent months mocking was about to turn their prestigious world into a graveyard of their own making. 1 hour, Ji-Hoon murmured, looking out at the clouds as the jet tore through the atmosphere toward Virginia. Hold on, Erica. The silence is over. The private reception at the Billiot estate was a masterclass in high society damage control. Inside the gilded dining room, the air was thick with the clinking of crystal and the hushed, satisfied murmurs of the elite. Sarah Billiot sat at the head of the long mahogany table, the stolen ceremonial flag placed prominently on a nearby sideboard like a captured banner. Kevin stood by the fireplace, nursing a 20-year-old Scotch, holding court with 2 members of the medical board. They were already discussing the rebranding of the neurosurgery wing, speaking of Erica in the past tense, as if she were a tumor they had successfully excised. The first sign that the world was about to tilt on its axis was not a sound, but a vibration. A low rhythmic thrum began to rattle the vintage champagne flutes on the table. It wasn't the polite hum of a luxury sedan. It was the heavy, synchronized growl of high-performance engines. Kevin frowned, glancing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the long, winding driveway. "Did you invite someone else, Mother?" Kevin asked, his brow furrowing as the light of multiple high-intensity LEDs cut through the evening mist, sweeping across the portraits of Billiot ancestors like searchlights. Sarah set her glass down, her eyes narrowing. Certainly not. The guest list was strictly vetted. One by one, a line of 12 identical pitch-black armored SUVs crested the hill. They didn't slow down for the perimeter gates. The gates simply hummed open as if recognizing a master. The vehicles moved with the terrifying precision of a Roman phalanx, circling the fountain in the circular drive before coming to a simultaneous jarring halt. The sound of 12 heavy doors opening and closing at once echoed through the estate like a volley of gunfire. The dining room fell into a stunned, icy silence. The guests stood, drawn to the windows by a mixture of curiosity and a sudden primal fear. Outside, 24 men in charcoal gray tactical suits stepped into the light. They didn't look like police or private security. They moved with the silent, lethal economy of a sovereign's personal guard. They formed a corridor from the lead vehicle toward the front steps of the mansion. "What is this theatrical nonsense?" Sarah demanded, though her hand trembled slightly as she gripped her silk napkin. "Kevin, call the police. Now." Kevin reached for his phone, but his screen was a dead, flickering black. "The signal. It's jammed. Everything is down." At the center of the motorcade, the door of the largest SUV opened. A man stepped out into the Virginia rain. He didn't wear a coat, and he didn't use an umbrella. Ji-Hoon Kong stood in the center of the drive, the light catching the sharp, masculine angles of his face and the cold, absolute authority in his eyes. He wasn't the quiet businessman Erica had described. He was a sovereign, radiating a level of power that made the Billiot estate look like a dollhouse. He didn't wait to be invited. He walked toward the front doors, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The 2 private security guards Sarah had hired to man the entrance didn't even try to stop him. They stepped aside, their faces pale, instinctively recognizing a predator they weren't paid enough to fight. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open with a force that made the crystal chandelier shiver. Ji-Hoon stood in the threshold, his gaze sweeping over the room until it landed on Sarah and Kevin. He didn't look at the elite guests. They were irrelevant. He looked only for the rot that had dared to touch his wife. "Where is she?" Ji-Hoon asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. It was the voice of a man who dealt in finalities. Kevin, fueled by a desperate need to reclaim his territory, stepped forward, his face flushed. You, the failed husband. You have a lot of nerve bringing this circus to my home. This is a private family matter. Leave before I have you arrested for trespassing. Ji-Hoon didn't blink. He didn't even look at Kevin. He simply adjusted the cuff of his shirt, a movement so calm it was terrifying. You are mistaken, Kevin. This is no longer a family matter. It is a diplomatic incident. He stepped into the room, his security detail filing in behind him and lining the walls. The nobody they had mocked at the funeral had arrived, and as he stood beneath the Billiot family crest, the elite of Virginia realized with a sickening jolt that the hierarchy had just been rewritten. The man standing before them wasn't a guest. He was the new owner of the silence. I will ask one more time, Ji-Hoon said, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. Where is my wife? Behind him, Erica appeared in the doorway, her hair still damp from the rain, her eyes no longer filled with the bone-deep exhaustion of the Billiot daughter, but with the cold, reflected fire of the Baek-ho matriarch. The transformation was starting, and the room grew so quiet that the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, marking the final seconds of the Billiot legacy. The silence in the Billiot dining room was brittle, a fragile glass ceiling held up only by the family's waning arrogance. Ji-Hoon stood at the center of the room, his presence an immovable anchor against the tide of Sarah's indignation and Kevin's frantic, impotent rage. Erica stood beside him now, her hand resting on the sleeve of his tactical jacket, a surgeon's hand steady and cold, no longer reaching for a love that wasn't there. This is an outrage. Sarah finally found her voice, though it was several octaves higher than its usual practiced silk. She gestured toward the tactical team lining her walls. You think because you have men with guns that you can rewrite the truth? My daughter is a malpractice risk, and her businessman husband is a common thug. Get out before I make sure you both spend the rest of your lives in a cell. Ji-Hoon didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at her. He simply tapped a button on the watch encircling his wrist. The Billiot name is built on the myth of integrity, he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. But myths are easily dismantled by data. Suddenly, the large, ornate smart mirrors and the high-definition display screens that usually cycled through Billiot family portraits flickered. A sharp digital chirp cut through the air, and the screens went black for a heartbeat before erupting into a jagged, high-contrast glow. Kevin's face went the color of curdled milk. What are you doing? Shut it down. On every screen in the room, and unbeknownst to the Billiots on every tablet and phone held by the elite guests, a video began to play. It was grainy but clear, captured by a hidden security camera Kevin had forgotten existed in the back office of his own law firm. The timestamp was from 3 nights ago. The room watched in a horrified, hypnotic hush as Kevin Billiot appeared on the screen. He wasn't the grieving brother or the prestigious lawyer now. He was a thief. The audio, cleaned and amplified by Ji-Hoon's tech team, filled the dining room with a crisp, damning clarity. If the signatures look even 5% off, the board will flag them. Kevin's voice rang out from the speakers, sounding hollow and desperate. On screen, he was hunched over a light table, carefully tracing Erica's signature onto a series of fraudulent malpractice reports. He held a high-precision fountain pen, his brow furrowed in concentration. It has to be perfect. If she goes back to Seoul, she's out of our control. Mother wants her patents and I want her gone. This is the only way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. On the screen, a second figure appeared, a high-ranking administrative clerk from the medical board, accepting a thick envelope of cash from Kevin. Make sure the leak looks accidental, Kevin told the man. I want the board members to feel like they're discovering a scandal, not being told one. The video looped, showing the moment of the forgery over and over, the forged scalpel caught in the act of carving a lie. The elite guests, the very people Kevin and Sarah had spent decades cultivating, recoiled as if they had been physically struck. The murmurs that had once been directed at Erica's disgrace were now a jagged roar of disgust aimed at the man by the fireplace. Kevin's glass of scotch slipped from his hand, shattering against the hearth. It's a deepfake, he stammered, his eyes darting toward the exits, only to find them blocked by Ji-Hoon's silent sentinels. Mother, tell them. It's a digital fabrication. But Sarah Billiot didn't speak. She looked at the screen, then at the stolen flag on the sideboard, and finally at Ji-Hoon. For the first time in her life, the matriarch looked small. The failed businessman had not brought a lawsuit. He had brought a digital execution. He had bypassed the courts and the social circles and gone straight for the one thing the Billiots valued more than money, the public perception of their perfection. Ji-Hoon looked at Kevin, his expression one of bored contempt. My team didn't just play this here, Kevin. It's currently being uploaded to the server of every major news outlet and the State Bar Association. By tomorrow morning, the only thing disgraced in this family will be your law license. Erica stepped forward, her eyes locked on her brother. She didn't feel the bone-deep exhaustion anymore. She felt the cold, sharp clarity of a surgeon finishing a difficult procedure. You said miracles were for people with clean records, Kevin, she said, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. It looks like your record just became terminal. The digital retribution was absolute. The screens flickered one last time, displaying the frozen image of Kevin's hand signing Erica's name. A permanent monument to his betrayal. Ji-Hoon reached out and took Erica's hand, his touch warm and grounded. The theater is over, Ji-Hoon said, his voice a finality. We're leaving. As they turned to walk out of the estate, the Billiot name lay in ruins on the floor along with Kevin's shattered glass. The nobody had not just saved his wife. He had dismantled an empire without firing a single shot. The digital wreckage of Kevin's reputation still flickered on the screens, but the air in the Billiot ballroom had turned from shocked silence to a predatory chill. Ji-Hoon didn't move toward the door. Instead, he stepped deeper into the room, his hand never leaving Erica's. Every step he took toward the head of the table felt like a mountain moving toward a hill. Sarah Billiot stood frozen behind her chair, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the stolen ceremonial flag. Her world of carefully curated optics was bleeding out on the floor, yet she clung to her arrogance like a life vest. You think a video changes who we are? She hissed, her voice trembling with a desperate, dying venom. We are the Billiots. You are a footnote in a tragedy. You've ruined your brother, but you will never be more than a disgrace who married a common criminal. Ji-Hoon stopped exactly 3 feet from her. He was taller than any man in the room, but it was his stillness that dwarfed them. He looked at the flag in her hands, the legacy she had stolen from Erica, and then he looked Sarah in the eye. You speak of common criminals while your son forges legal documents and you attempt to extort your own blood for patents, Ji-Hoon said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that seemed to vibrate in the guest's very bones. You call me a footnote because you are blind. You spent months mocking Erica's husband as a failed businessman, because I didn't seek the approval of your pathetic, local social circles. He turned slightly, signaling to Min-ho, who stepped forward with a sleek, encrypted tablet. With a swipe, the screens in the room changed again. This time they didn't show Kevin's crimes. They showed a global financial map. The Baek-ho Syndicate's holdings, legitimate medical conglomerates, international shipping lanes, and the very venture capital firms that funded the Billiot Foundation's hospitals, began to glow in gold. The Billiot Foundation exists because the Baek-ho Syndicate allowed it, Ji-Hoon said, his tone devoid of heat, which made it all the more chilling. I have owned 30% of your debt through 3 different shell companies for the last 2 years. I stayed silent because my wife wanted to believe you were capable of love. I let you call me a nobody, because she wasn't ready to let go of the ghosts of this house. Kevin, slumped against the fireplace, looked at the screens with a hollow, wide-eyed horror. He was a lawyer. He knew how to read a balance sheet. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just sabotaged a sister. He had attacked the primary shareholder of his own existence. Erica is not a malpractice risk, Ji-Hoon continued, turning back to Sarah. She is the matriarch of the Baek-ho Syndicate. She is my wife, and she is the sovereign of everything I own. When you insulted her, you didn't just insult a daughter. You declared war on an empire. Sarah's face went a ghostly, translucent gray. The flag she held suddenly felt like lead. She looked at Erica, searching for the broken woman she had bullied at the graveside, but she found only a stranger with eyes like flint. Give her the flag, Sarah, Ji-Hoon commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a sentence. Sarah's hand shook so violently the fabric rustled. Under the weight of Ji-Hoon's gaze, and the silent, tactical precision of the 20 men lining her walls, the matriarch of Virginia finally broke. She didn't hand the flag over. She let it drop onto the mahogany table like a surrendered weapon. Erica stepped forward. She didn't look at her mother. She picked up the triangularly folded wool, the stars and stripes feeling warm against her palms for the first time all day. She tucked it securely under her arm, reclaiming the only legacy that mattered. "We're done here," Erica said, her voice clear and resonant, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the home that no longer had a hold on her. Ji-Hoon placed his arm around her waist, a gesture of absolute public protection. He looked at the guests, the elite who had whispered and turned their backs, and watched them shrink beneath his stare. "From this moment forward," Ji-Hoon announced to the room, "the Billiot name is a liability. Any firm, hospital or board that maintains a connection to Sarah or Kevin Billiot will find their Baek-ho funding terminated by midnight. You wanted to protect your reputation, Sarah. Now you can see what it's worth when you're truly alone." He turned Erica toward the door. As they walked through the corridor of tactical guards, the nobody and the disgraced surgeon moved with a combined gravity that silenced the entire estate. Behind them, the sounds of the Billiot world began to crumble, Kevin's quiet sobs, the frantic whispers of the guests distancing themselves from a sinking ship, and the heavy, oppressive silence of Sarah Billiot realizing she had lost the only asset that ever truly mattered. The sovereign's protection was absolute. As they stepped out into the rain and toward the lead SUV, Erica didn't look back. She didn't need to. The fire was behind her, and for the first time in her life, she was walking toward a throne she didn't have to earn. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the armored SUV as it pulled away from the Billiot estate, a sound like bone grinding against stone. Erica sat in the plush leather interior, the ceremonial flag resting across her lap like a silent, sacred weight. Beside her, Ji-Hoon remained a statue of calm, his hand still firmly enlaced with hers. Through the tinted glass, she watched the ancestral home of the Billiots shrink into the distance. The lights of the mansion, once symbols of prestige and belonging, now looked like dying embers in a cold Virginia rain. The motorcade didn't stop until they reached the private airfield. The transition from the muddy cemetery to the gleaming white fuselage of the Baek-ho Syndicate's long-range jet was seamless, a physical manifestation of the power that now shielded her. As they ascended the stairs, Erica paused for a brief moment, looking back at the horizon. She wasn't looking for her mother or Kevin. She was looking at the version of herself she was leaving behind, the woman who had spent decades begging for a seat at a table that was designed to starve her. "The board directors have already received the authenticated files," Min-ho said, stepping into the cabin as the engines began their low, hungry whine. "By the time we land in Seoul, Kevin Billiot will be facing a disbarment hearing, and the hospital's internal affairs department will have issued a formal public apology to you, Dr. Billiot. Your surgical theater has been fully sterilized and is waiting for your return." Erica sank into the oversized seat, the bone-deep exhaustion finally beginning to lift, replaced by a strange, soaring lightness. In the cabin's quiet luxury, the stifling air of Virginia felt a million miles away. She looked at Ji-Hoon, who was watching her with an expression that held no expectations, no ledgers and no conditions. "They'll try to call," Erica murmured, realizing for the first time that her phone had been silent. "They can't," Ji-Hoon replied, his voice a soothing dark velvet. "Your old number no longer exists. Your digital footprint in that country has been scrubbed. To the Billiots you have become what they always claimed I was. A ghost." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But to me and to Seoul you are the sovereign. You will never have to shrink yourself again, Erica. You will never have to earn the right to take up space." As the jet tore through the clouds, leaving the American coastline in the dark, Erica felt the final threads of her old life snap. She thought of the scraps she had once fought for, the cold smiles at Christmas, the conditional praise for a successful surgery, the flag she'd had to fight to keep. None of it mattered anymore. Under the syndicate's shield, she wasn't just reclaiming her career. She was reclaiming her soul. The tears that finally came were not the hot, stinging drops of the cemetery. They were cleaner, releasing decades of toxic weight. She squeezed Ji-Hoon's hand, a silent thank you that he acknowledged with a soft kiss to her knuckles. 10 hours later, as the sun rose over the jagged, beautiful skyline of Seoul, Dr. Erica Billiot looked out the window. Below her lay a city where she was respected, a home where she was loved, and a surgical theater where her hands were once again recognized as miraculous. The Billiots were a memory, a cautionary tale of a family that had tried to bury a queen and only succeeded in digging their own grave. Erica stepped off the plane and into the cool morning air of Korea. She wasn't the prodigal daughter anymore. She was the matriarch, and for the first time in her life she was exactly where she was meant to be. The silence was over, and the new sovereignty had begun.